Hi, it's Shiloh. Today we're going to be making the sous chef's bean and winter squash soup. Last night I started soaking the beans overnight. I've drained them and now they're simmering on the stove with the juniper and cedar as outlined in the recipe. Before we jump into making the soup, let's take a look at what other ingredients we're going to be using. For this bean and winter squash soup, you can use one bean variety or more than one. For this particular soup, I'm using black beans. Also going to need some oil, wild onions or leeks, some stock or broth, your choice of winter squash. Today I'm using a Gete squash. If you're using dry squash, you'll have to rehydrate that with some hot water. A small sprig of cedar, chopped sage. I'm using dry sage today. Cooked hominy, salt, sumac, and dried apple slices for garnish. After the beans soaked overnight, I'm cooking them with crushed juniper and cedar for about 20 to 30 minutes until the beans are tender. To prep the squash, I cut it down the middle and take all of the seeds out and put those aside to clean and save for later. My white bowl here is for all of my compost scraps, so I'm just using a sharp knife to cut off the extra rind and then chopping it into 1-inch cubes. Today I'm using dehydrated hominy, so I need to rehydrate it by pouring some hot water over it in a bowl and letting it sit for about 15 or 20 minutes. Now that I've got all my ingredients prepped, we can go ahead and start putting things together. Go ahead and turn on the stovetop to medium heat and add about 2 tablespoons of oil. Then I'm going to go ahead and add our onion. And give that a quick stir so that all the onion gets coated with some oil. And then just let that start cooking and sauteing until the onions are translucent or starting to get translucent. It's been about 5 minutes cooking the onions, and this is what they look like now. And now I'm going to add in our squash. Remember, I'm making a double batch here, so that's why it looks like so much squash. I'm going to add in our stock. And a very small sprig of cedar. And now we're just going to bring that to a simmer and cook it until the squash gets tender. So at this point, it's been about 20 minutes cooking on low to medium heat. And let's check the squash. Just going to use the side of my spoon to check how tender it is, and it looks like it's just right. So it's just getting tender. Now this point, you could go ahead and add your beans, hominy, and sage and move on to the next step. I'm actually going to let it cook for a few more minutes, and then I'm going to use an immersion blender to blend some of the squash and onions together so that it's a little bit more smoother consistency. But if you like a more chunky soup, I would go ahead and move on to the next steps at this point. So it's been about 5 or so more minutes of the squash and onions and stock simmering, and the squash is pretty tender now, and so I'm going to use this immersion blender to create a more smooth consistency. This is one of my favorite go-to tools. You could definitely just use a blender if you prefer to do this, but with an immersion blender you don't have to transfer it back and forth between a blender and your soup pot. You can just blend it right in there really easily. One tip if you're using an immersion blender is to make sure that you've let your soup cool a little bit, so it's not, you didn't just turn off the heat, otherwise you might accidentally flick up a little bit of hot liquid onto yourself. And so just let it cool a little bit, doesn't need to be all the way cooled down, just a little bit, and then you can go ahead and start blending. So you can see after I use the immersion blender, the squash is all blended together with the onions and it's more of a smooth consistency. So next we're just going to add our rehydrated hominy. Add that in. Our beans. Couple spoons of sage. I'm using dry sage from our little herb garden we've got out back. Give that a stir. And you're gonna let that just cook together for a while so all of the flavors can melt together. So we're just gonna let that simmer for a bit. I'm gonna put the lid back on and then we'll be back. Here we are with the final product, the bean and winter squash soup, garnished with apple chips and sumac.